Welcome to this episode of The Good, the Bad and the Odd One Out with your host Mark. Today I'd like to talk about every single entry into the Dracula Hammer series.
This is the story of Dracula, a creature who destroys all whom he touches. Dracula the terrifying, the feared, who sleeps in the tombs of the dead by day and arises at night to inflict his terror upon the innocent and the unsuspecting.
You must help me. You must. You're my only hope. You must.
I'll help you. I promise.
Please try and understand. This is not Lucy, the sister you loved. It's only a shell, possessed and corrupted by the evil of Dracula.
How do you destroy a fiend who has so far proven himself indestructible? Those who come to end his reign of terror stay to become his victims.
Castle Dracula is somewhere here in Klausenberg. Will you tell me how I get there?
You ordered a meal, sir. As an innkeeper, it's my duty to serve you. When you've eaten, I ask you to go and leave us in peace.
This is the doctor who dares to challenge the vampire Dracula. This is the anguished man who fears for the lives of his beloved, the girl who is his sister, and the one that is his wife. Dracula, the bedeviled master of all that is evil.
Okay, so in Hammer's history, it kind of starts with Dracula and kind of ends with Dracula for its first phase. Hammer's recently come back into production. It's been behind some quite good work, such as I believe the American version of Let the Right One In, called Let Me In, and The Woman in Black recently. Both quite good films. But they kind of came to they've been around since the 30s, but they kind of came to the fore in the 50s with horror films, pretty much starting with the horror of Dracula in, I think, 58, and The Curse of Frankenstein, both of which starred Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. However, I'm going to focus on the Dracula series, and the reason I say kind of bookends starting in, they kind of, the start of the Dracula cycle and the end of the Dracula cycle kind of coincides with the history of Hammer. They did make a couple of films after the last Dracula one. I think their last one was To the Devil a Daughter, which is kind of their failed attempt to break into the post-Exorcist kind of horror market. Well, it wasn't a wholly success. I haven't seen it, but I've never heard anything particularly good about it. I wouldn't mind seeing it sometime, though, just so I know for myself. However, we'll go back to Dracula. Dracula, there was 7 films really in the cycle of Dracula movies from Hammer. Dracula didn't actually appear in one of them. It was just other than in the title. And in one case, Christopher Lee didn't play Dracula, but mostly he did. Alright, the first one was Horror of Dracula, 58. I have talked about this at some length in an earlier podcast number 58 back in September of 2012. I talked at some length about it, so I'll kind of skip that particular one here, other than to say, wow, you can kind of see why the Hammer took the world by storm here, and Hammer became the home of horror pretty much for the 50s and 60s. In terms of the entire genre, obviously there was other people making horror films, but Hammer kind of dominated, and their sort of graphic, gothic, sex and violence mix went over quite well. It kind of, what really, films like Psycho, Psycho was back in the early 60s, kind of started to indicate it wasn't going to work anymore. And I think really something like Night of the Living Dead really precipitated it, and then things like The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby and some of the nastier British horror movies such as, or certainly more psychologically complex British horror movies such as The Wicker Man, Blood on Satan's Claw, and probably the most real-life horror such as Clockwork Orange and Straw Dogs kind of started pushing them out. They just couldn't deliver what audiences were coming to like. However, we'll go back to Dracula. There's a real impact to this film. Really, I think most of the energy from the film, to me, comes from Peter Cushing. And Peter Cushing is basically, I think, Hammer owe Peter Cushing an awful lot. He always brought his A game. He always was trying his absolute best and delivering really good performances, even in really shonky work. Peter Cushing was someone you could rely on. And I think to this day, Peter Cushing's in a film, you can think, this is going to be a good film. Worth seeing. I think back when I reviewed it, I gave it 78 out of 100. Really, really striking, great film, directed by Terence Fisher. I think this is a case of the first one is the best one. Really like this film, and I think it's probably everyone's favourite out of the Hammer canon, pretty much. There's the follow-up to it. I can't remember what year it came. It came a few years after. Again, directed by Terence Fisher, was Brides of Dracula. My understanding is Lee just point blank refused to be in this one. They thought he was just playing hardball to get his fee raised, but it turned out he really just didn't want to be in it. And they drafted in someone else and rewrote the part, so it was a different kind of thing. Now, some people think this one's a bit shonky and a bit camby and a bit dated. I really like this. I think it looks really nice. There's some quite striking imagery in it. There's some really mental performances. That some of the older ladies have some really great scene-chewing performances here, and it's kind of entertaining. But it also looks really beautiful. Terence Fisher had a real knack for making things look really nice and expensive looking, whereas he was kind of on a shoestring. And recently I read or heard that he was kind of quite a gentleman. He was not a real diva of a director. He knew what he wanted and he always shot to get that. But he was very calm and non-flustered and quite respectful, is my understanding of it. So that's good to know. I really like Terence Fisher. I think he's like a world-class director, and he really served Hammer well. And in this Brides of Frankenstein, there's a lot of fun things going on, particularly the end where Van Helsing has to rid himself of the curse of vampirism. He's had the bite upon him, and he has to pretty much figure out how to cure himself and beat the evil intact. And it's a really fantastic 15 minutes. Really clever way the vampires get from the master vampire gets dispatched. I just really like this film. I actually rate it the same as Horror of Dracula, 78 out of 100, though I do think the impact of the first one was definitely not there for this one. It must have been unbelievable to see this in the cinema when there was really not much anything like it, and you can see why Hammer really captivated the market for a good few years. Really enjoyed it, as I say. After this came Dracula Prince of Darkness, again directed by Fisher. This was a much lesser effort. It suffered from not having Van Helsing. There was, I think it was Father Shandor or Sandor was the protagonist, I guess, the fighter of the vampire here, though he didn't play that big a part. But the rest of the cast were kind of there, and it kind of in places felt like a costume drama. It was okay. It had a similar feel to the first two, but it was, of the three so far, much the lesser work. I enjoyed it though, for what it was. One thing about these films is they're all pretty short. They're pretty much less than an hour and a half, so you can whiz by them, and they're good fun to pass the time. So even if it's not as good as the others, it's a reasonable watch. It's 65 out of 100. It did look nice, but there was very little horror in it, and the story was kind of a bit comedy, not comedy even, lame comedy of manners, kind of. After this one came Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. This had a change of director. This became Freddie Francis rather than Terence Fisher. Now, Freddie Francis, again, I think is an interesting director. The films I've seen of him tend to be a little more explicit and a little more not quite as elegant as Fisher's, but they're still quite impactful, and there's some kind of, he always manages to fit one or two quite memorable scenes in it. In this particular film, there's the beginning and the end have quite memorable scenes. It begins, for example, with a woman, blood dripping down a bell tower, and a guy going up, and a woman being, it looks like strung up within a bell and bleeding from the neck. She's dead, I think. Yeah, she is dead. And that's quite memorable and quite a shock for the film to begin. There's a lot more blood in this than there is in the others. It flows freely, and there's some funny old things like Dracula's got red eyes and things like that. But again, I think this is lesser of the four. This is the less one. We're getting like a diminishing return here. The problem is he doesn't have a decent opponent here. Dracula doesn't have a decent opponent. He doesn't even appear much in himself. There's a couple of interesting bits. There's an interesting idea of like, not only do you have to drive a stake in, you have to do it with absolute faith and conviction, which means at one point he actually gets staked but gets away because the guy doing it refuses to pray or doesn't have the necessary faith to finish the job. Well, interesting idea. Never gets picked up again in the series, but it was all right. This, I think, was one of the first Draculas I actually saw as a kid, so it's very memorable to me. But only in that it was one of the first ones I saw. However, having said that, it's great death at the end. Great death. Dracula has a big cross on his front door, and he doesn't like it, so he gets someone to drop it down a pit. Or what was it, an empty moat or something by the front door, so it's out of the way so he can carry on. But in a struggle, he falls back, lands on the cross, gets impaled on it, starts to try and pull himself off the cross, but a priest who was his like servant and slave starts to pray, and that act sort of finishes off the job. So that's again, it was alright. It was a short film, 69. It's getting more explicit at this point, but I kind of like it. The next one in the series, it was a bit of a lift. This was Taste the Blood of Dracula, made in 70. So they're all they're sandwiched close together, these. This one was directed by a different director, Peter Sasdy. Again, he has some interesting work. He's kind of like Francis in he has a more explicit eye and introduce more explicit elements into it. But I kind of like this. It's got an interesting side in that it's sort of exploring Victorian hypocrisy. It's set in Victorian times, Victorian, I think London, or a set of like these upright men who you know frown on all sin and so on. They're actually part of some debauched club of hedonists who you know are chasing sensory pleasure, be it drink or women or whatever, drugs. And they come across Ralph Bates, who's like this, I don't know, Byron-esque kind of figure who insists he can show them like the ultimate experience if they buy what is essentially the dust that is made from the blood of Dracula. This is an interesting film because it actually starts with the end of Dracula has risen from the grave, and Dracula's been impaled, but you get it from a different perspective. It's a salesman who's kind of lost in the woods, travelling salesman who stumbles across this absolute nightmarish scene of Dracula being impaled and turned into dust, but he has the foresight to collect the cape and the ring, the dust that the blood turned into, and he's prepared to sell it to the highest bidder. So this Byronic figure gets this group to buy it. Then he has like a black mass ritual to rise Dracula, but these guys then get frightened and start. And when he wants them to drink the blood, they refuse. He drips his own blood into the dust, which becomes like this bubbling goblet of blood. He wants them to drink it, they refuse, and they start beating him, and they think they beat him to death, and then they'll run away. And then they're all kind of worried because they know there's his body in a church, or I think it's supposed to be a desecrated church, this kind of thing, because they're doing a black mass ceremony in it, so presumably it's a desecrated church. Dracula resurrects from his servant from the blood and decides he wants to take his revenge by latching onto the kids of these wrongdoers, and there's a really nice vibe to this film. It's a really interesting in parts. Unfortunately, it suffers again from a lack of a decent vampire opponent, but you can't have everything, and it's not bad. It does feature probably the lamest Dracula death in any of the series. It basically kind of realises in a church, and it starts to affect Dracula. He goes up on a ledge and he accidentally stands in front of this cross that's in the stained glass window, and it's just like, what? Why is he dying? It's just not clear. It's very silly. However, I do like the film despite all this, and I'd give this 71 over 100. So this is a real rise for me. This is the best one since after Brides of Dracula. And it's interesting. Looks nice. Oh, it's got quite a classy feel. So there's some Fisher-esque elements to it. But apart from the terrible lame death at the end, I like this. Right, then we get an interesting case of Hammer here kind of trying to do a reboot, which I think might be possibly the earliest kind of reboot within a studio of a film franchise that there's been. No, I guess James Bond's, if you consider things like George Lazenby as a reboot, that would have come a little earlier. But this was made in 70 as well as Taste the Blood of Dracula, or come out in 70. Scars of Dracula. This was kind of lame. There wasn't any opponent of any kind worth talking about. They just weren't effective. It was Dennis Waterman who's famous for the Sweeney and Minder, but he's just not good in this role. He's a young kind of lad, and it just doesn't work as an antagonist to the Count. What it does have in its favour is Patrick Troughton's like the little imp slave helper of Dracula. He's always solid and good to watch. So he was quite good. But in terms of some of the direction was okay as well, but in terms of the script was turgid and boring. There was a lot of excessive like sex and more violence in this. Dracula was whipping and like really aggressive and like nasty. This sounds a bit stupid, doesn't it, for to say that about Dracula, but much more a nasty, violent and sadistic is the word I think I'm looking for, character than he has been in previous ones. This film didn't work for me. Like the direction, didn't like the script, didn't like the most of the characters. I didn't think were very good. There was a few Hammer stalwarts in there. I think Michael Ripple was in this one. I can't remember for sure. He's always solid, but this one, despite the Patrick Troughton element, I'd only really give this one 40 out of 100. This is probably the worst one in the entire series, in my opinion. It was directed by Roy Ward Baker, who does actually come back and directs a one I'll be talking about later. After this, Hammer really felt they had to do something, so they updated it by bringing Dracula to modern times, and modern times in this context is 1972, and the film's called Dracula AD 1972, and this had a really terrific opening, which was like a hark back to a completely different, something that hadn't happened in any of the other films. It was like a new scene but set in the past, where Van Helsing was chasing Dracula. There was coaches involved, Victorian times it was. I think it was set in 1872, so it's set 100 years before this film actually is mostly based. And it had Van Helsing and Dracula fighting, and Dracula getting caught in running water, and Van Helsing using a broken wheel from the coach, the spoke of the wheel, use as a stage driving Dracula. That beginning scene is really good, sets the scene really well. Then suddenly we go to like this Hammer's version of the early 1970s, where there's a party and there's these kind of hippies. We're all really about 30 and straight as dies, but trying to be these trendy hippies, and they've got a band. And they're not doing anything particular. They're like having a bit of a dance, but like there's these old people standing around looking absolutely mortified, like they're having an orgy in front of them or something. But in fact, they're just having a bit of a laugh and stuff. Anyway, they all go off, and there's this one called Johnny Alucard. Yeah, you get that. Who persuades this group that he knows how to do these special ceremonies, and it'll be a blast. Basically, he kind of raises Dracula. They all go round. I think before they realise exactly what's happened, most of them leave, apart from one girl. It's Caroline Munro, who looks beautiful in this. Also, one of the group is the granddaughter of Van Helsing. This is a different Van Helsing from the one in 100 years before. It's like his grandson or something, but he looks exactly the same, obviously. But his granddaughter's in it, played by Stephanie Beacham, and she runs off too, and sort of is a bit rattled by all this. Anyway, Dracula rises. Johnny Alucard's still around, but Dracula eventually makes him a vampire underling, and it's kind of, it loses its way quite badly. Well, it loses its way right after that first initial scene, really. It's not very good. It's like really stupid idea to try and make 30-something actors look like young hippies. It reminded me of another film where there's a similar premise called, I think, Psychomania, where it's like a motorcycle gang. They're supposed to be really rough, but in fact they're all middle class. They're all about 30 and speaking sort of plummy Oxbridge accents, and it's kind of a great film, that, actually. But this kind of reminded me of that, and that sort of, yeah, they're really unconvincing as their characters. Anyway, Dracula decides he wants to put the bite on Van Helsing's granddaughter to take revenge on what Van Helsing's been doing to him through the ages, really, the Van Helsing family, I guess. And there's all sorts of shenanigans. To be honest, it's just not great, this one. One thing that did make me laugh, they were borrowing all over the place here. They were trying to bring in modern things. There was kind of shades of Clockwork Orange in this film too, done in rather a poor way, it has to be said. But there was kind of shades of that. One thing that hilarious in this is how Van Helsing dispatches Johnny Alucard, who's now a vampire. It's like watching Inspector Clouseau as a vampire kind of thing, or Mr. Bean or something. They're in an apartment during the day, but the sort of blinds are drawn. They're in an apartment, and he's wrestling with the vampire. He throws a holy book into his coffin, so he can't get into his coffin. The vampire's really cross. They're fighting. Somehow the vampire stands in a beam of light and gets knocked back like someone's punched him, and Van Helsing realises what he has to do. Gets a little like a makeup mirror or something, and starts shining the light in the vampire's face, and you almost hear a sound effect like a punch, and he gets knocked back like he's been punched. It's super funny. And the vampire runs into a bathroom, and this is where the Inspector Clouseau bit comes in. He accidentally pulls open blinds that are on the roof of the bathroom, so sunlight comes streaming in. He then screams, knocks a lever which turns on the shower in the bath, and then falls in the bath. So he's caught in sunlight and running water. It's like, oh my God. Yeah, I did laugh a lot. And the thing is, they didn't even have a decent special effect here. He kind of just looked like a sallow body floating there. He didn't melt or any cool stuff like that, so wasn't impressed. And then, Van Helsing goes on to dispatch Dracula. I'm trying to remember how he did it, and honestly, I cannot remember how he gets rid of Dracula in this one. I should have mentioned in Scars of Dracula there's an interesting dispatch of Dracula. He holds his big metal shaft and it gets struck by lightning, and so he bursts into flames. Yeah, okay. And then we come on to Satanic Rites of Dracula. This was made a couple of years after, or maybe 73, I'm not sure. Oh, sorry, my rating for Dracula AD 1970, 43 out of 100. It was rather poor. Wasn't as bad as Scars, but it was pretty poor. Right, so Satanic Rites of Dracula, this goes mental. This goes absolutely nuts. In this one, the story is set 2 years after the events of the last and does feature the same Van Helsing. There's also the character of his granddaughter, but this time played by Joanna Lumley. How about that? That's kind of an interesting twist. And also there's a policeman in it who was in the previous one too, who actually brings Van Helsing in. And this involves like some sort of weird satanic rites going on, but powerful men are somehow involved. They've been photographed going into this house, men in government and it's kind of a spy story. Well, it is a spy story. It's like a guy's been held prisoner and manages to escape and rat on what's been going on in there, and he's like a spy, but then he dies, so they've got just his word. One of the guys involved, it's like Special Branch or MI5 or something, is one of the policemen from the previous adventure, and he says, I know an occult expert who might help us in this, and I bring Van Helsing in. And then it transpires, and there's 5 men mentioned, 4 of which are like government ministers or senior scientists, and one turns out to be like a senior microbiologist in some university, which is a bit odd, and then people in government, and there's a 5th man called Denham, and they realise they haven't got any pictures of him, and pictures that are supposed to be of him are just empty pictures, so they think there was a mistake with a camera, or mistake in the camera went off at the wrong time or something, and that character's called Denham. And then it goes on. It turns out they kind of start to work out. There's all sorts of spy shenanigans. The other thing is, it's kind of Dracula's like Blofeld in this. He's a mastermind. He's a master criminal, and it turns out he's got this scientist to create this like super virulent version of the bubonic plague or the plague or something, which will destroy the entire world. So, yep, it's proper Blofeld. He's after the destruction of the world. Van Helsing realises he's tired of life and wants to die, but he's such an egomaniac, he wants to take the world down with him, or he wants his food source to disappear so he cannot be revived again. And there's a funny scene where Van Helsing goes to visit Denham, who's in a shadow and pointing lights towards Van Helsing, so Van Helsing just can't see who he is, and he talks like Bela Lugosi. He says, "Hello, Mr. Van Helsing," and all this, and it's kind of funny. And then he realises it's Dracula. They were taking a mickey here, weren't they? Really, Christopher Lee as Dracula doing a Bela Lugosi impression, please. It's a lot of fun though, a lot of very dynamic. There's a lot of energy in it. Cushing always brings his A game, so yeah, no doubt about that. There's some other funny touches, like his minions, in like Austin Powers, he has all these minions with like special hard hats on and special overalls. Well, the minions in this are like killer hippies, but they're not. Again, like the previous one, they're not hippies. They're 35-year-old stuntmen with conventional haircuts, rocking stuff like cool moustaches or great big sideburns and things like that, which were fashion at the time, and trying to pretend to be hippies. I'm pretty sure one of them had an afro wig. A white guy had an afro wig on, and they ride around on motorbikes and stuff. That was kind of fun. Fun film. It was ridiculous, but it was fun. Much more entertaining than the others. Certainly much better than AD 72. In fact, I'd rate this one 61 out of 100. It was fun. It was fun. But that was the last entry. Also, it's one of the few times Van Helsing and Dracula actually have some sort of dialogue together. Certainly when Lee is Dracula. Anyway, this film marked the last time Lee played Dracula for Hammer. But there was one other film after this where there was a Dracula played by a different character, different actor, whose name I can't remember. He wasn't very good. He certainly didn't have Lee's presence, and they unfortunately made him up to look like a sort of pantomime vampire, which was a bit unfortunate. Anyway, the film was Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, made kind of 74 again, it says, so same year as Satanic Rites of Dracula. It doesn't follow any sort of continuity. Again, it's set in like Victorian times, so it's like a different route off of after probably Taste the Blood of Dracula, or before even. Where this time it starts with a Chinese priest going to visit the castle of Dracula, going to ask Dracula for help, and Dracula says basically, "I'm going to take over your body, or I'm going to look like you." And the priest wants his help because he runs the Church of the Seven Golden Vampires, or the Temple of the Seven Golden Vampires back in China, and he wants to help. He wants them to come back into power. Apparently they've lost power, but through the course of the film they obviously haven't lost power. I don't quite understand that plot point. Anyway, Dracula looks like this priest after his initial pantomime makeup job, goes off. And meanwhile, Van Helsing, I can't remember his name in this one, Lorimer, I think, or something like that, is visiting China because he's investigating the Chinese myths of vampires and tries to get interest from the universities they all think he's a charlatan. But this guy comes and asks him to help him because indeed the Temple of the Seven Golden Vampires exists in near his village and in this region. This rich, Swedish woman played by Julie Edge who's travelling to sort of see interesting things, says she'll fund the expedition out. So they all go off. There's 7 brothers on the good side who've got all different martial arts skills. One's good with axes, and one's good with a bow, and one's good with a stick. And they got one sister. And it's kind of almost a Magnificent Seven with vampires and kung fu. Yeah. And they go off. There's some interesting things. There's some really bad things in this. Like the makeup's bad, really bad. I mean, Dracula looks bad. He looks like King Rat in a local pantomime production. He's just terrible. The vampire makeup is bad. It just looks like guys have had clay rubbed on their face, and the fangs look ridiculous. and they wear these golden masks to try and disguise, I think, how bad the makeup is. It's an interesting thing, though. This is a co-production between Hammer and Shaw Brothers. Back in the early 70s, Shaw Brothers produced a lot of kung fu films coming out of Hong Kong. They were pretty good films. There were some really good films. And also, Bruce Lee had sort of sparked a real interest in martial arts and kind of Eastern philosophy in the early 70s too. Enter the Dragon really opened up that thing. And kids, adults, everyone was really interested in karate and kung fu. And I guess that's what spurned this production. That's what encouraged this production to happen. It's way better than I think IMDb presents it as, and a lot of fun. It's ridiculous. There's like basically, let's throw a load of Eastern ideas and a load of Western ideas in a big blender, blend them up, and then get Van Helsing to spout them. He comes up with great stuff like, oh yeah, in the West, vampires don't like crosses, but in the East, it'll be other holy symbols like a figure of the Buddha will scare him, stuff like that. He never uses that, but that's the sort of thing he comes out with. And it's all about one of the vampires is dead, and if they get this like big medallion thing that looks like a bat, they can revive the seventh one. They're kidnapping like young girls from villages around, and it's a big kung fu fest. Really, lots of fighting, lots of funny old, red painter's blood effects. Arrows going through people's necks, but they're not quite at the right angle, so you can tell it's like a joke shop arrow. Stuff like that, but it's good fun. I enjoyed it, and in fact, there's some nice touches in the script. This was directed by Roy Ward Baker, who I mentioned had directed Scars of Dracula, which I didn't like actually, but I thought this was quite well directed. The choreography of the kung fu needed to be a little better, really, but that was an aspect of the time. The kung fu films back then were often not greatly choreographed. The best ones of the time would have been Bruce Lee films, really, but it was all, henchmen stand around and wait their turn to be beaten up by the good guy kind of fighting styles. But I liked it. There were some nice touches. There was a bit where the sister and this features Van Helsing's son as like a young dashing lead. He finds the sister quite attractive, and she's washing dishes in the stream, and he goes and helps her. It's dark, and the older woman, traveller, who's Julie Edge, is looking at them and says, "Do you think they may be falling in love?" And the sort of lead brother is saying, "Yes, I think they may be." And she says something like, "They're lucky. Whatever happens now, they'll have this moment they'll always remember," which is kind of touching in the middle of a film like this. And there's a few other touches like that. I'm really quite impressed. In those terms, and the music, they brought in the old school Hammer music from Dracula, and I recognised a bit from The Devil Rides Out, which I think was actually from Dracula originally anyway. There's some cool music. Makeup effects terrible, it has to be said. The ending's okay. It's alright. Overall, I really enjoyed this film much more than I thought I would, and it was a much better last entry than I was expecting. I had in my head, I haven't seen a lot of these films in a while, and I've never seen Legends of the Golden Vampires before. I had in my head, all the last three were all pretty much the same in quality as Dracula AD 1972. So it was kind of nice that Satanic Rites was actually quite a bit better, and this again was pretty good. I think I'd give this one something like... No, I'd give this one 66 out of 100. Pretty effective. Ignoring the special effects and so on, it was pretty good. Okay, so that's all of the Hammer Dracula films covered. I hope it might stimulate some interest if you've not seen some of them. I'd say it's almost like the first two and the last two and Taste the Blood of Dracula are the ones worth seeing. But I enjoyed all of them to some degree. Scars was really quite weak, but it had Patrick Troughton, so I like that. Okay then, bye.